Die Sprachübertragung beginnt jetzt. Alle Teilnehmer befinden sich im Zuhörermodus.
Okay, good morning. Welcome to our webinar. My name's Dave. My colleague Thomas is moderating. So Thomas, you can say hello.
Hello.
There we go. Thank you for joining us. So today I just wanted to speak a bit about setting up auxiliary sequences in Pandoras Box, using the layers that we have and creating additional timelines to help you do more complicated, or not really complicated, but more advanced things inside of Pandoras Box, create solutions that you can use and appreciate, and do more sophisticated things. So let's dive in. Of course, we have PowerPoint. So the first thing we have is a cheesy animation. If you have any questions, please feel free to pop up your hand, stick up a question. And what we're going to do today is use Widget Designer in Pandoras Box and use the communication between the two applications to do some pretty awesome stuff. So what we're going to cover: the sequences, the Widget Designer device, the Pandoras Box render path, working in the 3D environment, setting up additional cameras, which you can only do inside of a server, and then again triggering Widget Designer and triggering Pandoras Box vice versa, between the two applications. Okay, let's start with sequences. So in Pandoras Box, all of our layers are common, and we can set up multiple sequences. So the sequences allow us to trigger the layers that are common. It allows us to trigger them individually. So our sequences are completely independent of each other, and they're autonomous. Another tip with regards to setting up your sequences when you set up a project is it's recommended to set your frame rate to the majority of your content. So if you're playing back 60 frames per second or 30 frames per second content, set your sequence to that frame rate. This way you have higher accuracy, and you don't have frames kind of starting between your frames, your sequence frame rate. So it just helps with your rounding to have more accurate representation of your video content. Again, Pandoras Box can play back practically any frame rate. Just if your video content is always played back at its native frame rate. So you can't set your sequence to say 25 Hertz and then expect a 30 frame video to play back at 25 frames. That it doesn't do that. It's just really the resolution that we have for adjusting parameters within a timeline. Video content is always played back natively. And again, it's a good idea to set your sequences at a multiple of the frame rates. Right. Any questions on that? Okay.
I don't see any questions so far.
Okay. Okay. All right. Another thing that we've added while we're talking about sequences, I'm going to dive into that in a moment, just after I've spoken about the sequence tab. So our sequence tab, it's obviously getting a bit of a rework in the 64-bit version. So we've added some more colors to it, and you have now added icons so that you can very quickly, in a show environment, get an understanding of exactly what's going on in your sequences. So yeah, let's look at our sequence settings. So if I now change to, okay, so here's my Pandoras Box project, right? Okay, so let me explain a little bit what I've set up. So I've created, for example, I'm just trying to think of the best way to explain this. So I have this the show that's coming up, and I have a holding look, which is this engine moving around, right? And I wanted to create an auxiliary. So I wanted to create an auxiliary sequence, or I wanted to pre-build something that I could then recall over this look that I've created. Then what I can do is I've used my widget designer devices to talk between my two different sequences. So let's just recap again. So our sequence settings. My main show sequence is on sequence 1, and you can obviously adjust to the names of your sequence. You can set your frame rates. So this one I want to be at 30 Hertz. Then you can set the length of your sequences. Obviously, you can also decide an end action, whether you want it to keep on running once you get to the end of that sequence, or whether you want it to pause or to stop. You can also set up IP addresses for your individual sequences. So if you want to control other, send out other commands or send that information somewhere else, you can do that as well. You can also set up your timecode handling. So whether you want to receive timecode or transmit timecode from your sequence, you can do that in your inspector view. And then again, there is an opacity for each and every sequence, and that is the global opacity for that sequence. So there are situations or times when you would want to use that. Okay, so that's kind of what I've set up. Well, that's just in my sequences. There are some more examples coming up where I change my default setting handling on my different sequences. So now what I'm going to do is talk about the widget designer device. So if I jump back in here, now in order to trigger different things from Pandoras Box, I need to have a widget designer device and a widget designer project. So what you can do is from your assets tree or your assets folder, or your device type, sorry, from your device types folder, you can then go and drag a widget designer device and put that into your sequence. What you then need to do, obviously, is set up your IP address inside of your widget designer and set up your IP address inside of your widget designer device in your Pandoras Box project, so that the two can obviously will be able to communicate to each other. If you've set this up correctly and you've enabled your connections between the two, your red exclamation mark will then resolve, and it should look like that. So there you know that your communication between the two applications is established. So if I jump back into my project, here's my show. What I've done, let me just show you how I've done it, and then I'll run it so you can understand what I've set up. So I have my widget designer device is sitting here with my IP address. It's all active, it's all working, and I've set up a key that is on my sequence, and it's one frame behind my pause cue, so that when my sequence runs, it will then trigger those commands to my widget designer. So in this one, I have some key set up. So I have tell it to go to a certain queue on my auxiliary sequence. I set it to play, and then I change my label to give myself information, and then I set it to play again afterwards. So if I change and go look at my sequence where my auxiliary sequence, or where my content is that I want to play over this look, I can then have a look here on my auxiliary 3. So I can see there is my my piece of content that I've set up. I've also set out a play cue at the end. And again, at the bottom, I've set up another key to then change the color of my label and then set my sequence 1 to do something as well. So I'm triggering from my first sequence, tells my auxiliary sequence what to do, like, hey, go play this video file for me, please. And then at the end of it, I want you to tell my first sequence to go back out of a queue. And then, do its follow-up command from what I've set up. So if I then go and fetch my widget designer, here is my little widget designer I've set up. So I've created some buttons just to trigger my show. And I have on the right side of my control panel for them, I've set up some nodes to read the clip remaining, the queue remaining time, so to my next queue. So that's to my fade out. I've also set a time code, and I've put in information, and I've put in stuff inside of my widget designer keys that I can then read that information and be able to understand what's happening in my environment. So if I set this to play, there we go. So now my auxiliary sequence is running over, or my auxiliary sequence is running over my my background loop, and it's giving me a countdown in my widget designer. And then once that gets to the end of it, it's going to then release. You'll see it now in a couple seconds, and then it triggers my next queue to run in my main sequence. So I've combined the two different sequences in my widget designer. So there comes my logo fade in, and then it holds on that. So there's quite easily stuff that you can trigger in and out of that. So again, just to run it again for you, so you can see the different the ideas that you can start coming up with. So let's just wait for this one to do its thing again. Also, I don't like webinars. I hope I've made you think about stuff, and that hopefully you can get some questions coming back. Okay, so another situation or another use case where this might come in handy for you is if you have a live camera. So for example, my customer says to me, or my show caller says, hey, I want to have a live camera coming up, and then 3 or 5 seconds later, when the live camera, when the speaker's settled at the podium, I want a name strap to come up with the speaker's name, so that for the live feed, for example, that the people know who he is. You can also very easily go and set something like that up inside a Pandoras box. So I've set up I've created another little section here just with the button for my live camera, and I've got my 3 name slides set up. So if I click on my live camera is going to come in, and then 3 seconds later, I've told it to fade in my my name slide and then do a movement out again. That's very easy to set up. Let me show you how I did it, just so you can also use these things to help you just to create easier show control environments. So if I go to my image magnification sequence, so it's always a good idea to give your sequences names. I'm sure you do. I like calling them things. So I've got here in this sequence 3 keys for my widget designer. I set the tint of my custom script button, and then my next one, I've changed the name, and then I've also set obviously the color, and then again I set it back. So if I go back to my widget designer, So you see here my camera is live, and I've changed the name and I've changed the color. So this is also really nice because if I'm sitting in a control environment where I cannot see that my cameras are live to screen, for example, I at least know that with the information that I'm reading back from my widget, from my sequence, I know that I'm at full opacity in my project. And again, I can change the names and bring up a new speaker title with a new speaker. And again, that's all happening on time because I've also set in my, if I go back here and I go to my name strap sequence, you can see I've got a pause cue. So when I bring in my speaker title, it pauses on a cue and then fades in and out. This one is a lot more simple because there's no, I don't need to trigger anything from the widget designer. Again, if I wanted to, I could put a key in my script to say, change the speaker title button to red, for example, so that, sorry, let's go back to the widget designer, so that my speaker name would highlight in red, for example. So you can also set that up quite quickly and easily. Are there any questions on this stuff so far? No?
No, not really.
Okay. All right. So that's using the feedback between my different sequences. Now, let's dive back into our PowerPoint. So we've covered some examples. Now we can move on to something a little bit more advanced, and that is setting up using our render passes in Pandoras Box, and again multiple sequences to create different looks and different looks and more flexibility inside of your show environment. So I put a meme in, I had to. So using our render passes in Pandoras Box. So Pandoras Box has two render passes, right? We have our composition pass, which allows us to do all of the creative stuff. And there's a little breakdown for you of what happens in there. So we have our different layers, and they're ordered sort of from lowest to highest being obviously closest to the camera. Again, you can change that with your Z positioning. So you can go and move your objects around, move your layers around, etc., etc. Then obviously we have our different layer types. So we have the video layers, the graphic layers. You can add light layers. You can add a particle system layer. So you can add all of these different elements in our composition pass, that we can then go and create stuff with in our sequences. Then we obviously look at these with our cameras, and our cameras then take this render target and hand it over to our output pass. And our output pass is also really helpful because it gives us, a lot more flexibility in how we work with things inside of our 3D engine and work with things inside of our 3D environment. So if I go to our output pass, our output pass, this is where our digital world meets our real world. So on the other end of the DisplayPort connector, this is where it comes together. So the output pass takes our render target, and we can then add our warping, we can add our effects engine to it, we can do color correction, we can do the keystoning, we can do some black level compensation. So this kind of all takes place inside of the output pass. And to give you an example of what you can then do knowing this and working with this, and also using multiple sequences, you can start doing things like this. So let me bring in my widget designer and my project again, and now we can sort of look at our 3D environment. So here's our 3D environment. Here's let me calm down my cameras. Okay, so my 3D environment, I have some existing stuff that I've created. I'm just going to clear my camera out. There's my engine again running to output 1. I've created an additional camera in my server, and I'm using that to create a look. So for example, in this show, the customer said, hey, I've got a teapot, let's project on the teapot. And they didn't have budget for it, so they said, can you just put something together in Pandoras Box, put some stuff that we can project onto the teapot? Sure, okay. This is really fun example. So what we've done is I've now set up my model, and I've applied my I've applied my model in my 3D space, and using my buttons I can no, go away, wrong button, sorry. I can now recall my positions on with my widget designer, and I can go and start looking inside of my 3D space. What you'll see I've got here is this is my model sequence, and I have applied a texture to it. Let's just go. Sorry, where's my color bars? Let's go put the color bars on my teapot. So here is my teapot in my 3D environment, and I've applied a texture to it. And you can see that texture because it's happening in the composition pass. But now we want to do something a little bit more fancy, and the customer said, hey, can you take this video, maybe put a particle system onto it? So I have a particle system here generating some particles, and can you take this and just be a bit more creative, put something on the teapot? So we can do that. So okay, sure, customer, that's not a problem. We can set that up for you. So if I now go and look at my camera, I can see here is my teapot with the texture on it. But now I want to go and apply this render pass. If I go to all cameras, I want to go and take what I've created, and I want to go and apply this to my teapot. But now this is why I was speaking about the render passes. So I want to share a camera texture with it. So I've now applied camera 3. As you can see in my device view, I've applied it to this teapot. If I look at it in my camera's view, so if I go to camera 2, I can see it there, and I can then also route this to my output. So I can now see my teapot in my output. Now, what we can do using our sequence defaults. So our sequence defaults kind of determine they determine what happens to a sequence and what happens to those keys and containers in a sequence when you execute a play command or a pause command. So every time you update that sequence, those commands and those keys will be affected. So if I go to my sequences folder and I look at my model, you can see here it says only mesh media. And this means for this sequence 5, the only defaults that will be enforced will be mesh and media. So I want my model to stay there, and I want my texture to stay on that model.
Sorry,
so
Dave,
now,
if I can shortly interrupt, what is the reason for the defaults, or what are the defaults doing? Can you explain a bit about what happens with the defaults?
Yeah, sure. And You can feel free again to jump in again, Thomas, to add some more information on that. Thank you for bringing that up. So the defaults, basically the defaults open another level of flexibility with your layers and your sequences. So if I have, for example, if I go to, let's just go to show one. So my sequence one, if I'm running my sequence one, every time I hit a container, it will then force a particular piece of content to be loaded, and it will do it will cause certain things to happen. So if I have a whole bunch of containers with enforced defaults, it will then say, for example, force the opacities to be on and off, to be faded in and out. Excuse me. If I wanted to do then something more complicated with my sequences, I could, for example, then say, all right, let me, if I wanted to create a movement, I could then switch my defaults off for that particular sequence, and then only apply those different parameters to that layer that I'm working on. So when I get the opportunity to get control of Pandora's Box again, it doesn't seem to like this webinar software.
When I can jump in quickly to round this up a bit. So the main thing for the default for the sequence is to set the layers back to default as soon as a container is applied to that layer somewhere, right? So as soon as I put a container on layer 1 on sequence 1, it's not caring where you have the now pointer. So if you play the now pointer, it will always set layer 1 to defaults, right? That's what it's doing. So also if you're not in the container, it will apply the defaults to all the parameters. That's what defaults means on, or enforced defaults means on that sequence setting. Right? Just to make that clear again.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. You're much more eloquent with some of these details than what I am. Awesome stuff, thank you. Okay, so what we've done and what I've created up here is I've also now again set up some stuff in my widget designer. So I've got my camera looking at my teapot, and I can then also using a set of keys in my sequence, I can now also go and create a movement for my camera looking at my teapot. So if I now go and I look at my output, I can then see my camera rotating around my 3D object, and it has the texture from my third camera that's been handled through the render pass has now been applied onto this output. Then what I can also do using another sequence, I can, for example, now go and bring in a movement of my teapot. So if I go to my teapot sequence, I can then start moving my teapot as well. So I've now created an additional sequence, and I'm using no defaults. So the only information that I'm applying to my layer, so it's my device 2.7 where my schmodal is, that is basically the only parameters for that particular sequence and that particular object is I'm just changing my position. So I'm bringing that up and down. So I have, in this instance, I have two different, no, it's actually, sorry, I'm feeding it with 3. So my sequence 8 is my Y position. My sequence 7 is my model texture. So I have this texture feeding my camera 3, which I'm then applying onto my texture itself. And then I have my model, which is then assigned in my 3D space with its initial texture on it. And I've also then assigned my camera onto my texture. So there is a lot of things you can do using that flexibility. Again, you could, for example, you know, I'm trying to think of an idea that you could use here. If you had, you know, if you had to move the teapot in the middle of a performance, or the customer said, okay, we want to raise the teapot or lower the teapot at an independent time, you could do that using a separate sequence. You could also feed that information in through a tracking system, for example. So using the different sequences, it allows you to break complex production elements down into really simpler tasks. Yeah, I think that's what really makes Pandoras Box super powerful. And I think that's pretty much all I have to talk about today. Are there any questions on that?
Thank you, Dave. Not so far. Maybe I can put some ideas in. So the maybe you can speak a bit more about the I like to call it the submix. So that's a submix feature, right? What you're doing with camera 3 to apply things on different layers. So maybe you can explain once again the route from the second render path back into the composition space again, and maybe we find some more things where you can apply a thing such as a setting.
Okay. Do you mean in terms of okay, yeah, sure. Okay, so let me just go to my model sequence and let me pause my teacup because so camera's still, and there we go. Okay, so what we can do here and how we've set this one up, let's go into our well, let's go into our 3D environment at the outset. Okay, so here's my 3D world, right? And my cameras are looking into my 3D world. My cameras also then feed that information into my output. So if you look in your layer tree, I'm just going to recap right kind of from the beginning, just in case we have some new guys and girls that are exposed to Pandoras Box. So here's my camera, and this is my my device viewer for my camera. So this is my camera layer, and my camera is my way of capturing what's happening inside of my 3D environment. This information is then passed onto my my output, and in my output I can then also set up different cameras. So I can, for example, in my output 1 have camera 1, or I can also change that to camera 3. So it allows you to set up different routings or routings inside of your Pandoras Box, so you can send different cameras to different outputs. We have this so that you can create submixes inside of your environment or inside of your 3D world. Again, it gives you more creativity, it gives you more flexibility. It allows you to do some really complex projection mapping. It's also really helpful when you need to warp or you'll use meshes on difficult objects to work upon. You could also use that very nicely. What you can also then do is you can also go and apply a camera onto a particular layer. So you don't have to only apply the cameras on your in your output passes or in your output layers. You can take a camera and go and apply it directly onto a layer itself. So for my model, I've got my camera 3 being routed directly in there. I can then also go and apply a text, sorry, not a text, a still image onto my teapot, and there it is handled as a texture. So you can obviously use your cameras in layers. You can also, if you're doing a lineup, again, just to throw another point in there, if you're doing a warp, or you're doing a what do you call it? You're doing a complex blend or a setup. You can also go and apply an image directly into your output. If you need to work on some projector calibration or some projector alignment, you can also then go and do it directly from your output layer. Yeah.
Yeah.
Does it make sense? It is quite a chunky subject, or kind of topic to get around.
Yeah, it's huge.
You know,
It's kind of difficult to put it in some minutes. Yeah. I have some questions for you.
Yes.
So one question is it possible to render and share texture in a virtual camera without losing a real camera? Maybe we can go for license things and restrictions there. Yeah, maybe you can explain a bit around setting up virtual cameras, how to and what's what you have to have for that.
Okay, so thank you for that question. So in order to set up virtual cameras, you can only do it on the server licenses. Unfortunately, it's not available in the player licenses. So it's bound to the servers. Setting them up and working with them, again, you can work with your virtual cameras wherever you want to. Unlatch, there we go. You can manipulate your cameras as you need to. So in my 3D environment, I have my camera 3, and I can then go and inspect my camera 3 inside of that space. What I can also do, let's just reset this. Let me just think of a nice little example for you. What I can also do is, if I go to my, okay, here's my output. Let's go to output 1, sorry. Here's my output 1. And if I need to, I can also go and reroute my cameras. I want for example, my first output to become my third camera output. So it's also a way of, I guess, of routing your different cameras to your different outputs. Why we have that is it allows us to create different compositions or different areas inside of our 3D environment, which we can then use on different layers, or we can apply those to different textures, or again, as with the teapot demonstration, you can then go and apply a composition or a little thing that I've created and go and apply it to a texture or a model. So it's just about adding flexibility in what you do, so that you're not bound purely by one sequence and your 2 cameras going to outputs. You can go and create different things, and yeah, just open your flexibility into what you can accomplish. More questions?
So, yeah, the one I will answer for everybody now, so actually not. Yeah, let me, yeah, I think that's it.
Cool.
Nobody else has a question.
Okay. Well, I think in that case, thank you for logging into our webinar. I hope I was able to give you some little pointers or some hints in, you know, what you can do, you know, using Widget Designer and Pandoras Box. Also extending your extending your confidence in a show environment to use what you have to feed information back to yourself in creating different scenes, creating different looks, reading information from your system so you know exactly what queue you're on, where you are, opening up better and easier show flow opportunities for you. Thanks.
Cool.
Thanks for joining. Thanks,
Yeah,
Thomas.
and thank you, Dave. That was great. I'll put a little link in the chat for you to find. We welcome any feedback and any ideas for further webinars. So let me find. Shit, I missed the link. Oops.
Thomas said a bad word.
Thanks, Dave. I'll put that in the link in the chat so everybody can join that.
Cool. All right.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for joining. Wait, hold on. It wouldn't be a webinar if I didn't have a last slide for my PowerPoint.
Okay.
Thanks for joining. We'll see you on the next one. And if you have any questions, you can obviously email support. No, Pandoras. Thomas, what is our support email address? support.pandorasbox at christiedigital.com. Drop us a mail. We'd be happy to help you out. You can also give our support number a call. We are still available for support. We're all working remotely, but we're there to help you. And thanks.
Yeah, thank you. See you next time.
Cool.